In 1977, the USDA quietly removed lard from its recommended household fat list, replacing a 4,000-year-old cooking staple with hydrogenated soybean oil shipped from a Cargill processing plant in Decatur, Illinois. Your grandmother kept rendering it anyway, in a cast iron pot on the back burner, every November after hog-killing. She fed a family of 7 on roughly $11 a week and outlived 3 federal dietary guidelines. Number 4 on this list is something a coal miner's wife in Pennsylvania used to make for 9 cents a quart, that the FDA effectively legislated out of every American grocery store by 1987. Number 7 is sitting in a tin in your grandfather's barn right now, if anyone bothered to look, and it still works exactly the way it did when Herbert Hoover was president. Stay with me. What follows is not a recipe list. It is a quiet inventory of what was taken. There is a specific window in American food history, roughly 1958 to 1978, when the pantry of the average working family was deliberately gutted, not by accident, by design. The Food and Drug Administration's generally recognized as safe list expanded from 197 ingredients in 1958 to over 3,000 by the early 1980s, and most of what got added were industrial substitutes for things your grandparents had been making at home for pennies. The General Foods Corporation, Procter & Gamble, Standard Brands, and a handful of grain conglomerates spent an estimated $340 million across 2 decades convincing American housewives that the staples sitting in their root cellars were primitive, dirty, or dangerous. They were none of those things. They were just unprofitable to the people who needed them to disappear. The shelf-stable, the home-rendered, the dry-cured, the lacto-fermented, anything that did not require a barcode. Your grandparents knew this pantry by heart. They could feed a family through a 14-month strike, a Dust Bowl winter, a polio quarantine, a 1973 grocery boycott. We forgot, and forgetting was profitable for someone else. Here are 9 of those staples, and exactly why they vanished. Number 1. Hardtack. In 1862, the Union Army issued 9-ounce hardtack squares with an 18-month verified shelf life at a per-unit cost of just under 4 cents, and those exact squares were the dominant calorie source for nearly 2 million soldiers across 4 years of war. Civilian families kept making it through the Great Depression and the Second World War because a single batch, flour and water and salt, and a 300-degree oven for 6 hours could feed 2 adults for an entire week on roughly 11 cents of ingredients. Your grandmother's mother probably had a tin of it on top of the icebox or above the bread box, replaced once a season, never thrown out. It was emergency food, road food, lunch pail food, and porridge starter all in one. The mechanism is brutally simple, and once you understand it, you understand most of pre-industrial food storage. You bake the moisture content below 10%, which is the threshold below which mold, yeast, and almost every pathogenic bacterium cannot metabolize. They have nothing to eat. The water activity drops below 0.6, and the food essentially becomes inert mineral matter that happens to contain calories. A properly dried hardtack square, stored in a dry tin, lid pressed tight against a strip of waxed paper, will outlast the person who baked it. Civil War hardtack still exists in private collections in Pennsylvania and Virginia, edible after 160 years if you soak it in coffee or broth long enough for the water to penetrate the dense flour matrix. The Continental Baking Company, which owned Wonder Bread, lobbied state school lunch programs from 1954 onward to mandate enriched commercial loaves with a federally subsidized purchase price, and hardtack quietly fell off federal civilian rationing lists by 1961. The federal government eventually pivoted to commodity white bread with a 7-day shelf life, a 600% markup over the cost of flour, and a chemical fortification additive that did not exist anywhere before 1942. Nobody banned hardtack. They just stopped teaching anyone how to bake it. The tin disappeared off the icebox. The recipe stayed in nobody's head. Number 2. Sourdough starter, passed down by generation. A live wild yeast starter from 1898 still bubbles in a refrigerated crock at the Boudin Bakery in San Francisco, fed continuously for 128 years, and your great-grandmother almost certainly kept one of her own on the warm corner of her kitchen counter, fed once a day with a single tablespoon of flour and a splash of well water from the back pump. Cost to maintain across an entire calendar year? Roughly 18 cents in $1939. The starter was sometimes named, sometimes inherited from a sister or a neighbor, sometimes carried west across the Great Plains in a covered wagon in a glass jar tucked between the children. The mechanism is what your grandfather would have called a friendly infection. Wild lactobacillus species and indigenous Saccharomyces colonize the flour and water slurry, producing lactic and acetic acid that lower the pH of the dough below 4.0, which both leavens the bread and prevents almost every spoilage organism from competing for the available substrate. A loaf made from a mature starter needs no commercial yeast, no preservatives, no dough conditioners, no calcium propionate, no sugar, and stays edible on a kitchen table under a clean dish towel for 6 full days without refrigeration. It also gluten pre-digests during the long 12 to 24-hour ferment, which is why a significant percentage of people who cannot tolerate commercial bread can often eat properly fermented sourdough without any trouble at all. Fleischmann's Yeast, owned by Standard Brands, ran a 22-year coordinated advertising campaign starting in 1949 across radio, women's magazines, and eventually television, telling American women that maintaining a wild starter was unsanitary, old-fashioned, and beneath the standards of a modern home, and that a 7-cent foil packet of dry commercial yeast was the scientific alternative for the scientific household. By 1972, the home starter was effectively extinct outside of Alaska, parts of Appalachia, a few Amish counties in Lancaster, and the kitchens of a handful of grandmothers who simply never listened to the radio. The food industry sold convenience and took the household microbiome with it. Your grandmother fed her starter before she fed herself. Number 3. Suet. In 1934, a 1-pound block of beef suet cost 6 cents at the average American butcher counter, often free for the asking if you bought a roast at the same time. And it was used for everything from steamed Christmas puddings to flaky pie crust to winter bird feed cakes to candle making in a pinch when the kerosene ran low. Your grandfather's mother rendered hers in a copper kettle on the back of the wood stove every January, yielding roughly 14 ounces of pure tallow per pound of raw kidney fat. with the crispy brown cracklings saved out and salted in a separate dish for the children to eat on bread. The mechanism here is that the saturated fat structure of suet, with its 50% stearic acid content and almost no polyunsaturated fraction, gives it a smoke point of around 420 degrees Fahrenheit and a refrigerator-free shelf life of nearly 2 years in a cool pantry. It does not go rancid the way industrial seed oils do, because there is almost nothing in it for oxygen to attack and oxidize. You can fry a potato in it in March, and the kettle of tallow on the back of the stove will still taste clean and bright in October. The American Heart Association's 1961 dietary statement on saturated fat, funded in significant part by the Procter & Gamble company that just so happened to manufacture Crisco vegetable shortening, told an entire generation of American housewives that animal fat caused heart disease, and that hydrogenated vegetable shortening was the modern, scientific alternative for the family that cared about its health. The science behind that 1961 statement has since been quietly walked back by the same institution across multiple revisions. Most recently in 2017, when trans fats from partial hydrogenation were officially classified as dangerous. But suet never came home to the American kitchen. The kettle is rust now. The pie crust never tasted right again. Your grandmother knew. Number 4. Raw milk from a single named cow. A coal miner's wife in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, could buy a quart of raw milk from a neighbor's single dairy cow for 9 cents in 1948, and that milk would keep, ungassed and unpasteurized, in a stone crock down in the root cellar at a steady 52 degrees Fahrenheit for 4 full days. The cream would rise to the top in a thick yellow layer overnight. She would skim it carefully for butter on Saturday morning, working a wooden paddle until the buttermilk separated. The skim would feed the children with their oatmeal Monday through Wednesday. The clabbered remainder from the bottom of the crock would become cottage cheese by Tuesday afternoon, drained in a square of cheesecloth tied to the kitchen sink faucet. 4 distinct dairy products from 1 quart of milk. 0 packaging, 0 waste, 0 refrigeration past the cellar shelf. The mechanism is that fresh milk from a healthy, pasture-raised animal grazing on a mixed sward carries its own protective enzyme system, including lactoperoxidase and lactoferrin, along with native lactic acid bacteria, which actually inhibit pathogenic colonization for the first several days after milking. The milk protects itself the way it has done for the entire 9,000-year history of dairy domestication. The 1987 federal interstate ban on raw milk sales, enforced by the FDA under 21 CFR 1240.61, effectively legislated this transaction out of every American grocery store and most state lines, citing isolated outbreak data from the 1970s that did not differentiate between sanitary small herd operations with refrigerated handling and crowded confinement dairies operating on a different scale entirely. The American dairy industry consolidated from 648,000 small dairies in 1970 to fewer than 31,000 by 2020. And the milk that replaced your grandfather's quart from Bessie now travels an average of 1,300 miles between cow and carton, processed through 4 separate facilities. The cow had a name. The carton has a barcode. The cottage cheese has 14 ingredients, and one of them is wood pulp. If this video is helping you think about the American pantry differently, a quick like helps the channel keep making this kind of content. Completely up to you, just wanted to mention it. Number 5. Dried beans bought by the 50-pound sack. In 1939, a Sears Roebuck mail-order catalog listed 50 pounds of pinto beans for $1.89, which works out to under 4 cents a pound and roughly 88,000 calories of complete protein storage food when paired with corn or rice for the missing amino acids for less than $2 total. Your grandmother kept hers in a galvanized tin in the back of the pantry, lid weighted with a brick or a flat iron to keep the mice and weevils out. And that single 50-pound tin would feed her family of 6 across an entire winter, supplemented with whatever came out of the garden, the smokehouse, or the chicken coop. Beans were Monday food, Thursday food, soup base, salad cold, mashed for sandwich filling. The mechanism is that a properly dried legume at 10% moisture or below is biologically inert. There is no water for spoilage organisms to use, almost no enzymatic activity, no measurable oxidation to speak of in a sealed container. Stored cool and dry in a sealed tin, dried beans remain viable, edible, and nutritionally intact for 25 years, and often considerably longer, with cooking time the only thing that lengthens noticeably with age. Archaeological samples of dried beans from Egyptian tombs have germinated after thousands of years. The 1971 introduction of canned, ready-to-eat beans by Bush Brothers and Company, marketed aggressively as a labor-saving modernization for the busy working housewife, repositioned the dried bean as something only poor or rural or backward people ate, while the canned version sold for nearly 6 times the per-serving price at the supermarket. The Bush family's company revenue grew from roughly $5 million in 1968 to over $200 million by 1990, an almost entirely synthetic market built on convincing your mother that soaking a bean overnight in a bowl of cold water was beneath her dignity. The food industry did not invent the bean. They just invented a reason to charge you for soaking it. A pressure cooker and a Sunday afternoon used to be free. Your grandmother knew that a pot of beans, a piece of cornbread, and a slice of raw onion was a complete meal for a family of 4 on under 40 cents in 1955 currency. And she did not need anyone in a marketing department in Knoxville to tell her so. Number 6. Home-rendered lard in a stoneware crock. A 5-pound stoneware crock of home-rendered lard sat in nearly every American root cellar from approximately 1880 to 1955, kept fresh by its own saturated fat structure and a thin top layer of solidified tallow that naturally sealed the contents against air, light, and pantry moths. Your grandfather's family rendered theirs from a single fall hog every November after the first hard frost, yielding roughly 35 pounds of usable cooking fat for under $2 in 1942 dollars, plus the salty fried cracklings the children fought over, plus the prized leaf lard reserved specifically for pie crust and biscuit. Rendering day was a family event. The kitchen smelled like roasting pork for 2 days. The mechanism is the same one that preserves suet, with an added structural benefit. Pork lard contains roughly 45% monounsaturated fat, almost exactly the same ratio as olive oil, which is exactly why pie crust made with proper lard flakes correctly into hundreds of paper-thin layers holds its shape under wet filling and tastes the way pie used to taste before the supermarket version flattened into something cardboard and rubbery. Procter & Gamble's introduction of hydrogenated cottonseed oil under the Crisco brand in 1911, followed by a 40-year coordinated marketing campaign that called lard old-fashioned and unrefined and unhygienic, and ran free cookbook advertorials in nearly every American women's magazine, from Good Housekeeping to Ladies' Home Journal, shifted American baking fat consumption from 76% animal rendered in 1910 to under 8% by 1980. Here is the part that should make you genuinely angry. Crisco is partially hydrogenated cottonseed oil that was originally invented as candle wax when electrification of American homes made commercial candle making unprofitable in the early 1900s. Procter & Gamble had a warehouse full of industrial wax-grade fat with no customers and a balance sheet problem. So they hired chemists to turn it into a food product and a New York public relations firm to convince your great-grandmother that the lard in her crock was killing her. They sold you industrial candle stock and told you it was healthier. That is what happened. Number 7. Dried apple rings strung from the rafters. In 1928, the typical Appalachian farmhouse kitchen rafter carried 12 to 18 strings of dried apple rings, each string roughly 4 feet long, harvested from a backyard tree planted by somebody 2 generations dead and threaded on cotton twine using a darning needle. Cost to produce? Effectively zero, since the apples were already there and the heat from the wood stove was already on and the twine was already in the sewing basket. Your grandmother dried hers above the wood stove from late September until the strings turned leather brown and rattled like dry leaves when you brushed past them on the way to the cellar door. The mechanism is that apple flesh, sliced thin to roughly 3 millimeters and exposed to warm, dry air for 48 to 72 hours, drops below 20% moisture, at which point the natural sugar content above 15% and the malic acid pH around 3.3 together prevent microbial spoilage for up to 2 years in a sealed tin. A pound of fresh apples becomes roughly 5 ounces of dried apple, concentrated and shelf-stable and edible straight off the string or rehydrated for pies, dumplings, fritters, applesauce, schnitz und Knepp, or stewed with a pork chop in February. The Sun-Maid Cooperative, based in Kingsburg, California, began aggressively marketing commercially dried fruit in the 1920s, with roughly $8 million in annual ad spend by 1958 across radio and women's magazines. But the real institutional shift came in 1965 when the USDA's school lunch nutrition standards stopped accepting home-dried fruit as a qualifying serving, effectively forcing rural Appalachian and Midwestern school districts to purchase pre-packaged Sun-Maid product at roughly 14 times the cost per ounce of what the children's grandmothers were doing for free at home. The tree in the backyard kept producing every fall like it had since 1898. Nobody was home to string them anymore. There is probably a tin of them in your grandfather's barn right now, brittle and brown, and still perfectly edible if you soak them overnight in apple cider. The rafters are empty. The orchard is mostly gone too. Number 8. Lacto-fermented sauerkraut in a 5-gallon crock. A 5-gallon stoneware fermentation crock filled with finely shredded cabbage and roughly 3 tablespoons of pickling salt per head produced 35 pounds of probiotic-dense sauerkraut for under 80 cents in 1953 currency, often using cabbage harvested from a single 10 by 10 foot patch of the family garden. Your great-grandmother kept hers down in the cellar from October through April, weighted with a clean ceramic plate and a smooth river stone roughly the size of a fist, and a single crock would feed a family of 6 across the entire scurvy risk season of a Midwestern or Pennsylvania Dutch winter. She also made fermented green beans, pickled cucumbers, kimchi-style turnips if she was from a Slavic family. The crock was a household appliance. The mechanism is one of the most elegant in the entire 12,000-year history of human food preservation. Lactobacillus plantarum and its bacterial cousins convert cabbage sugars into lactic acid through pure anaerobic fermentation, dropping the pH below 4.0 within roughly 14 days, which both preserves the cabbage essentially indefinitely and creates roughly 10 million colony-forming units of beneficial bacteria per gram of finished kraut. The vitamin C content actually increases during the ferment rather than decreasing, which is exactly why German and Eastern European sailors did not get scurvy on long Atlantic crossings to the New World between 1620 and 1800, while British sailors did. The 1937 introduction of pasteurized canned sauerkraut by the Frank's Kraut Company, followed by the post-war collapse of cellar-equipped housing in tract neighborhoods built between 1948 and 1965 with concrete slab foundations and no basement at all, effectively ended home fermentation as a household practice across most of suburban America within a single generation. Pasteurization kills 100% of the live bacteria in a single 165-degree pass, which is the entire reason the food was medicine in the first place. They sold you the cabbage and threw away the medicine. Your grandfather's gut microbiome would not recognize what is on the shelf at the supermarket today in a vinegar-pickled jar processed at 180 degrees and labeled the exact same word. A 5-gallon crock costs roughly $90 at any farm supply store. The salt costs $3. The cabbage is essentially free in October. Number 9. Cracked corn and field peas for the laying flock. In 1936, a 100-pound sack of cracked yellow corn cost $1.40 at the local feed mill, and the typical American farm wife maintained 14 to 22 laying hens in a backyard coop that converted that corn into roughly 280 dozen eggs per year at a net feed cost of roughly half a cent per egg, once you factored in the kitchen scraps and garden cull that supplemented the ration. Your grandmother fed her chickens potato peels, stale bread crusts, garden cull, crushed eggshell baked back to powder for calcium, and a daily scoop of cracked corn out of a tin scoop hung on a nail by the back door of the kitchen. The hens followed her around the yard. The eggs were on the table by 7 in the morning. The mechanism is brutally efficient and largely forgotten today. A hen converts roughly 2 pounds of mixed feed into a pound of eggs across her productive lifespan of 3 to 4 years. and field peas added to the ration at a 15% inclusion rate provide the lysine and methionine that corn alone lacks, creating a complete amino acid profile without any commercial soy meal, synthetic supplement, or proprietary feed blend. The yolks were orange because the hens ate green plants and bugs. The whites stood up tall in the pan. The 1957 introduction of confined housing battery cage systems by Tyson Foods and subsequent vertical integrators across Arkansas, Georgia, and Mississippi, followed by the consolidation of the American egg industry from 1.6 million small flocks in 1950 to roughly 200 industrial operations producing 95% of supermarket eggs by 1995 effectively ended the backyard flock as an economic unit in suburban America. Most American suburban municipalities passed ordinances between 1962 and 1978 making it illegal to keep a rooster within city limits, and many ended up restricting hens as well under noise and nuisance statutes that had not existed anywhere a single generation earlier. The chicken did not change. The zoning did. A hardware store still sells cracked corn in 50-pound paper sacks, if you know what you are looking at, often stacked on a pallet near the back next to the rabbit pellets and the deer corn, priced under $18 in 2025 money. Your grandmother would recognize the sack. The sack has not changed since 1948. There is a specific kind of grief that comes with realizing what was taken from you was not a recipe or a technique or a 50-pound sack of beans. It was a relationship. Your great-grandparents lived inside a dense network of small, durable, intergenerational knowledges that connected them directly to the calories they ate, the fat they cooked with, the milk that fed their children, the cabbage that kept them from getting sick in February, the hen that laid the egg in the blue bowl on the kitchen table. None of it required a barcode. None of it required permission from an agency. None of it required a paycheck large enough to pay someone else to do the work of feeding your family. For roughly 12,000 years of continuous human civilization, the household pantry was a form of quiet sovereignty. And then, across only about 60 years, between roughly 1920 and 1980, that sovereignty was deliberately and methodically disassembled, ingredient by ingredient, brand by brand, by a handful of large corporations and cooperating federal agencies who together understood a simple commercial fact. A family who can feed itself for 11 cents a meal is not a customer. Your grandfather was the last person in your bloodline who knew most of this without ever having to be taught any of it. The chain broke at his kitchen table sometime in the 1960s, in a tract house with no cellar and a brand new chest freezer. Most of us are the first generation in roughly 400 continuous generations who would actually starve, or at least go quietly hungry, without an intact industrial supply chain standing between us and dinner. That is not nostalgia. That is the math, and the math is exactly what your grandmother understood when she kept rendering lard in November of 1977, even after the USDA told her not to. Pick one this week, just one. Buy a 5-pound bag of dried pinto beans for under $8 at the regular grocery store. Soak them overnight in a bowl of cold water on your kitchen counter and cook them on a Sunday afternoon the way your grandmother did, with a yellow onion, a piece of smoked pork, 2 bay leaves, and a long, quiet simmer. Or render a single pound of beef suet from the butcher counter into a glass jar of clean tallow that will keep on your pantry shelf for 2 years, and fry a sliced potato in it on a Saturday morning. Or string up a dozen apple rings on cotton twine above your radiator this October and see how they taste in February when nothing fresh is left. Tell me in the comments which one you are trying first, and whether anyone in your family, an aunt or a grandmother or a great uncle who still lives on the old farm, still remembers doing it the old way, because somebody almost certainly does. Somebody in your bloodline did all 9 of these things without thinking about it, the way you brush your teeth or tie your shoes. The knowledge is not gone. It is just sitting 1 generation back in a tin on top of an icebox in a kitchen that does not exist anymore, waiting quietly for one of us to walk over and pick it up again.